content on today's episode includes having hard conversations that may be geared towards older children and at times may be centered on adult themes. Parental discretion advised.
Welcome to Together We Rise. This season, titled For the Parents We Are and the Kids They'll Be, we'll explore the joys, challenges, and transformative power of parenting, one honest conversation at a time.
Whether you're here to gain tools, share a laugh, or find reassurance, this is a space where imperfection is celebrated, connection is nurtured, and growth is always possible.
Each episode dives into topics that matter, from embracing the messy reality of parenting to fostering resilience, self-worth, and authentic relationships.
Together, we'll uncover practical insights, powerful stories, and the heart of what it means to parent with intention.
So, take a deep breath, settle in, and join us as we navigate this beautiful, complicated journey. One step,
one story,
and one lesson at a time. Welcome back to another episode of Together We Rise. With you here today is Tonya,
Maggie,
and Amy.
Today we're going to talk to you about navigating tough conversations. How do we approach talking about hard things with our kids? What's the line of honesty to, oh, this is taken too far and you're not developmentally ready to hear this? We don't know all the answers, but we're here ready to engage in the conversation.
What in the world? There's so many different hard conversations that we have to have with our kids, and I never feel like fully prepared to have them. Like, I don't know if you guys have ideas of like, what are some of the things you do to prepare for a hard conversation? What are some of the things that have helped you like step into those conversations? But for me, it's always like, I don't know if I'm ready for this.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm ready ever either. And I feel like kids seem to bring up things at the times in which are like the least opportune to talk about it. And I feel like I've felt the pressure as a parent sometimes of when they bring something up, like I should talk about it right there versus like, actually, I need some time to think or process this. Could we come back to this? But then the fear in my own mind of like, well, then they won't be ready to talk about it when I come back to it. It's so hard.
Yeah, classic kids, right? They bring up the big conversation and the big question when you're trying to get them to bed at night or when you're like knee deep in like doing 10 other things and you're like, hold on. I need to think about that for a second. And I have definitely said that before. I need to think about that for a second. Can we come back to that later?
I love that, like being able to like just sit with it and be like, hold on, that's such a good question. You're asking something really important. I need to go sit down and have a conversation with Daddy so that we know exactly how we're going to talk to you about this, or so that I know that what Daddy wants to say and what I want to say are going to make sense to you. Like having that like pause for me as a parent probably is really important, because it allows me, one, to collect my thoughts, but two, to like talk to my husband and be like, whoa, they asked this, I was not ready for this. Like, what's our next step? What's our next move?
Yeah.
I think it's important too to ask some clarifying questions sometimes, because I think what we think that they're asking isn't always what they're asking. I think the classic example is maybe like a 4 or 5 year old, like where do babies come from? Yeah. Like, are they really wanting to understand how babies are created and made, or do they just want to understand that babies are born at the hospital and then they get to come home, you know? And so I think sometimes you could take pause and give yourself some time to gather by asking some clarifying questions, or well, what do you think the answer to that question is? And I think that's really helpful.
I love that, like that first initial like question of like, what do you think, as like a gauge of like, okay, where are you at in what your conceptualization is of this topic, to like help me then like determine what's my next step.
Yeah, I think this has been hard waters to navigate. We're really like transparent, open, honest family. It's just one of our big values. And coming to recognize and hearing stories from other parents of like their kids are Googling this stuff at school. I mean, kids have Chromebooks like in their hands by first grade, right? And so I have a friend whose kiddo was like Googled or on their tablet in second grade, like, what are boobies, right? Like, because kids are curious. And for the first time, which we didn't experience in our generation, like they have access to actually seeking this information that's not a dictionary or an encyclopedia. And so it's challenged my husband and I to really think about like, how are we going to engage in these conversations? Because I would rather them come talk to us about it and know that we're going to be real while trying to be developmentally appropriate in order to make sure that they're coming to us to engage in these conversations more than maybe what is their natural tendency when they get older, which is friends or the internet.
Yeah, I think that's like the big question is like, where do you want your kid to get this information? Do you want your kid to get the information from you, or do you want your kid to find it someplace else because they today will have access to find any information that they want?
But you have to have like kind of the foresight of thinking about what are the things that they might want to know or are learning about or hearing about that I might want to think about how to address. And that's really hard because it does require some like ideas of what things, I mean, could you guess that that child was going to Google that? Who knows, you know, but it really requires you to be on your toes as a parent.
So then tell me what you guys think about then what you share, wanting to be developmentally appropriate and honest, how you navigate that. Because if my 10-year-old says, how are babies made, right? And I then decide as a family that I'm going to share something that isn't 100% accurate, but more watered down. And then later they recognize what was the real 100% authentic answer. Are you unintentionally creating shame around the topic by saying I wasn't really comfortable in having that conversation? Are you saying it was too hard to have these conversations and we're not really capable of tough conversation? Or am I overthinking all of this?
I mean, in our house and in our family, we've tried to be just like really direct about that topic specifically. It's like we have told our kids this is how babies are made.
Yeah,
I think
it's not a stork who comes to your door.
It's not a stork. It's not a Cabbage Patch. It's not magical fairy dust on a mommy's belly, right? Like we talk about all of the things in our family. And so when they get to the age where they are having sex or are curious about having sex, there's a conversation first, hopefully with us, about how do I make these choices? What's safe? What's not safe? Like what things should I be thinking about? And you know kids aren't going to share everything with you as a parent, but you want them to have some line of communication. And I think for us, we've thought if we can have that line of communication open early and often, they're more likely to use that in the future when they really need to. Do they really need to know at age 6 how babies are made? No, I probably could have watered that down and told a different story. But just like you said, are they going to then say, Mom was not comfortable with talking about that. Mom was nervous. And so then when they're 16, they're going to be like, Mom is not going to talk about this. That's going to be too much for her. She's going to be nervous. She's not going to understand. I wanted to open that conversation up and have that line of conversation early and often. So we also don't talk about it just one time. Yeah. It's come up multiple times.
I agree. I think it's also really important to demonstrate kind of listening, active listening with our kids. Someone once told me like it's really important that you listen to the small things and that you pay attention to the small things and the little questions that your kids ask, because someday they will be big things and they will be big questions. And so you really need to demonstrate that they are important and what they have to say is important and what the questions that they ask are important. And so you need to address them and talk about them and show them that you care, even about the tiny little things. Every morning, my morning starts every morning at 6:30 with my 12-year-old telling me her wild dream from the night before. And do I always want to actively listen to that? No, it's really hard, but that's important to her. And so I've hopefully shown her that I'm willing to listen to all the little tiny things because someday they're going to be big things and I really need to be able to listen to that.
I love that. Like last night, my 5-year-old, she was getting such a kick out of me guessing the names of her friends at school. Like that's just another example, right, of how like these little things right now, they're going to be bigger things later. And so if I talk to her about her friends now when she's 5 and it's just like silly things of like, Mom, guess all my friends' names, it later becomes like, Mom, talk to me about this stuff that I'm having a hard time with my friends.
I think we all kind of share the same philosophy. We're really direct and open in our house. We have the tough conversations. We've talked about masturbation. We've talked about sex. We've talked about belief in certain magical people and the realness of that. And I'll say, right then, I feel like at a younger age, maybe they were privy to certain information that their peers weren't, and how to have the conversation and navigate like, hey, our family has talked about this, but other families may not have. How do you navigate that water?
I think exactly what you just said. I mean, I think having that conversation at home and knowing that this is a place that we can always talk about these things, and I want you to ask these questions. Not all families are having these conversations, but it's really important for kids to be able to ask their parents those questions, right?
I like that a lot.
Of course, kids are going to always want and talk about things with their friends that I'm sure there's lots of speculation about lots of different things, but I do think telling kids that not all families talk about this in the same way, and that covers a lot of topics, right? We've talked about sex specifically, but like you're talking about religion and political beliefs and relationships and sexuality. I mean, there's a million topics that it's important to say not all families talk about this in the same way, and that's okay. And it's really important to encourage kids to talk to their parents about those things or guardians.
Yeah, I also think kids have such a sense of whatever I hear first feels the most true. Like I've found that with my kids that if like I'm not the first person to share something with them, whoever told them first, that feels the most real. So sometimes with kids, like I always think about the timing sometimes really matters. And if somebody gets to my kid first on a topic, that might feel more true to them, especially if it's somebody whose relationship they really value or who they think is really important. And so I've also kind of thought about that sense of like, man, really knowing the timing on when to bring certain topics up.
I think also one of the things that we as a society unintentionally teach kids is how to just be like compliant and not curious. Because I think we unintentionally really just teach kids, especially through their education, like do what you're told and what you learn is the absolute fact or truth when it's not. We get to be curious in life about things, and we get to figure out how to problem solve and think through things. And I think a lot of this does help us then navigate tough conversations, because there isn't just a right and wrong. There's an exploration of the many possibilities. And I think we're missing opportunities sometimes of how to cultivate this in kids.
Well, I think tough conversations are tough because there's so much gray in them, right? And you think about, I mean, it's easy to talk about sex as a tough conversation because I think that's one that is universally tough for parents, but it is tough because it's gray. Because it is really hard because some people say this is okay, some people say this is okay, and there's about 50,000 things in between. And so it's really hard.
Can we also just say it's also hard because we have connected a lot of shame to sex throughout society and throughout life. Like from the beginning of time, it is connected to bad and shame. And I think that is what makes it a tough conversation, which is fascinating to me, of unintentionally what we're saying about something that could be and should be beautiful.
Yeah, I think a lot of those tough conversations have shame rooted through them, right? Like we can think of other tough conversations around race, right? Like I think race is another one that parents and caregivers have a really hard time navigating. Like how do we talk about race in our home? And there's a lot of shame connected to that and rooted in that, especially for white families. How do we talk about those things, right? Like white privilege, white guilt, all of those things. But like those are other topics that I think are really important for us to have conversations around, because again, who do I want my kids to get that information from? Me. And have the values that I have and share those with them. And so just thinking about like, I mean, really, there's so many different topics that really can be so tough to navigate, but are just so important for us to have with our kids.
It makes me think of like 5+ years ago, one of my kiddos came home and said, like, did you know that only a woman and a man can get married? And I was like, oh, where did you hear that from? You know, and he said where he heard it from. And I was like, well, tell me a little bit about the conversation, right? And well, what do you think? And then we had a conversation of like, well, our family, or mommy and daddy, and this could be where mommy and daddy don't maybe think the same thing, but in our family, mommy and daddy thought the same thing and said, you know, this is what we believe, but other families or other adults or other people could believe other things. The really neat thing, buddy, is you don't have to decide what you believe right now, and you can believe different things as you grow up. And it was so interesting because he was like, well, no, when they said that to me, I already believed that that wasn't true. And just how much that says, like, our ability to have some of these tough conversations is our openness for kids to show up with different thoughts and beliefs versus automatically saying, no, we don't believe that. That's not okay. You can't express that, you know?
Well, that's why I think it's so important to be curious and to do as much listening as talking in these conversations, because I think it can sometimes turn into sort of lecture-y in nature, or this is kind of how we think about this. And I think it's super important to ask questions, to help kids be curious, hear their thoughts about different things that honestly might be different than yours. And that's okay. I mean, ultimately, that's what we're trying to grow, is independent adults who can think for themselves, who can ask questions, who can explore, who can be curious outside of what everyone else maybe in their world thinks. But that's tricky.
You know, I think that that's one thing that my parents did well around certain topics. Like, I remember my dad asking me questions about politics. Like, I care a lot about politics. Like, that's one of the things that I pay attention to, I listen to, I'm engaged in. But I remember him asking me questions about, what do you think about this? And not telling me this is what we think. And so it cultivated for me that ability to like really reflect and be curious around, what do I feel like is right? How would I want that to happen? Like, what do I think is the right thing for our government to do or say or provide for our citizens? Like, those are conversations that he had with me and my siblings at a really young age. And I think all of us have grown up to really care about those things. So it's fascinating to think back about, he didn't lecture or tell us those things. He asked us questions.
That's really neat.
Yeah. I think this is really important. When I was thinking about this topic, I was thinking about difficult conversations to navigate. And I think one is regarding like romantic relationships in general, because it does lead into all these different pieces, right? I think you want kids to be able to develop what is a worthy partner for you. What does respect look like? When are the choices that you're making? How do you set boundaries in relationships? How do you know when it is not a positive relationship? Because if I just tell them it's not, that's not going to go particularly well, right? And probably they will push away and they probably won't talk to me about that relationship anymore, which is the exact opposite of what I want to happen. And so helping kids from a pretty young age think about the things that are important to them and their family, and having them develop thoughts around this and questions around this, I thought about in relationships is pretty important.
Your kids are a little bit older than ours, and so I'm like curious how you sit with that, because I have to imagine that there's times where you want to be like, no, no, that sounds bad, don't do that. And like, how do you like regulate yourself, ground yourself so that you can listen in those moments?
You know, I think you just have to take care of yourself in those moments. You have to deep breathe. I think I have to remind myself sometimes, like, I don't have to have an answer immediately. Like, I can sit and pause with this. I can tell my kids I need to think about this. So I do some of those things. I think I try to do just sort of regulation tools in general of whatever it is for you, whether it's I'm going to walk around, I'm going to pace, whatever it is. But it's hard, because I think what can happen is those can be really emotionally charged conversations that suddenly then you get into different waters that you don't want to get into, and you don't want your own emotions to take over what you're trying to communicate to your kids.
Yeah, I think that's a big piece that I've been reflecting on, is like how you mitigate kind of the fears of having these conversations. Okay, I got wrapped up in the conversation and didn't stay regulated or curious, or, you know, and I just kind of went into lecturing mode. Yeah, what do you guys do to kind of manage some of that?
I think one of the things that's been helpful for me is having conversations with other parents. Because like when I know like a tough conversation is coming up, or I know I want to start to have, you know, some of these conversations around different things, there are certain parents that I bounce ideas off of. You know, like my sister and I talk a lot. And it really, like when we talked about Christmas and our family's going to be with your family, what does your family know about Christmas? And what does our family know about Christmas? And like talking about how those conversations have gone with another parent who I know shares my values, I know that we have some similar beliefs, has really helped, I think, me navigate some of those conversations. And one, it's just like, feeling like you're not alone in some of this too, I think is really helpful.
It sounds kind of funny, but I think honestly practicing these conversations with your partner maybe is a good place to start, because you obviously want to communicate the same types of things, even if you're going to communicate them differently. What would be better coming from you versus me? Like I said, we have 3 daughters, and so there are certain things that I think come really effectively from me. there might be things that are really helpful to come from a male perspective, from my husband. And so practicing those conversations. And I mean, there's no doubt, I've walked away from conversations with my kids. I'm like, that did not go the way I wanted it to. I wish I would have said this. And I think it's okay to circle back to your kids. And I think it's okay to say, that didn't come out right, or I was feeling upset, or I didn't communicate that way in the way I wanted to. Here's what I really think when you've had some time to think and pause. I think, again, back to repairing with kids. Sometimes we do get emotionally charged. We're humans, and being able to circle back and say, this is what I really wanted you to hear from that conversation, and I hope this is what you heard from it.
And I'm scared. Like, I'm scared for you to have a phone. I'm scared for you to stay home alone. I'm scared, but we have to talk about it. We can't just put our head in the sand and pretend it's not existing. We can't pretend that you're not gonna ride your bike across town, but my fears of you getting kidnapped, right? And I can't push my fears onto you, because then you're not going to live the life that I want you to live. So I think sometimes just naming, like, hey, mommy has fears right now that are coming up for me. Like, I need to sit with those and breathe through those. Like, I know I can't control everything, although I want to kind of control everything. And I want to be able to hear your perspective and why you're asking to do this, or why you're asking these questions. So I'm going to breathe through my fears right now.
I like when you say name it to tame it in the sense of, like, I'm nervous to have this conversation. I think that models for kids that I'm going to have the conversation even when I'm nervous or even when I'm uncomfortable. That tells kids something. That says that this conversation is important enough for me to have, even if it's not super comfy for me. And it also models for kids that even if you're uncomfortable with this conversation, it's still important for you to talk with me. I think that's laying some good groundwork for in the future, when absolutely they're going to be uncomfortable to come to us with some of these things. But we've modeled that that's what we do even when we're uncomfortable. I think the other thing that I thought about is sometimes talking about how we talked about it when we were kids is helpful. To say, like, my parents didn't talk to me about this, and I really wish they would have, because there were times where I needed to ask my parents something and I didn't ask them because I was way too nervous to talk to them. So even if I'm uncomfortable about this, I'm going to talk to you about this, because I don't want you to be in a situation where you don't feel like you can talk to me. So, like, helping them understand what that looked like for you as a kid, I think can help them feel like mom was a kid once upon a time and this mattered for her, and it can matter for me too.
I was a kid. I know, I get it. Not fully, like maybe not into the experience you're fully having right now, but I get the desire to want to be able to, run around town for hours and hours without checking in. I get it.
I think helping them to understand we've experienced these things. It's sort of shocking to them, like, wow, you had to do that? It's like, yeah,
someone broke up with you and hurt your heart?
I did, yeah, and I remember. It does humanize us, and I think that's really important. We're not just their parents, we're actually people that experience these things too, and maybe learn from them. But I think it's important to, like, make sure that we separate their experience from our experience, because I do see that happen a lot where parents are like, oh, well, I had that experience, so I know it must feel like this or this or this. And it's like, well, you might have a general idea, but they might be experiencing it in a totally different way. And so it's important to seek that connection or that distance from those things.
It makes me think of, like, as I may have experienced it differently than my child, but their siblings could go through the same things and experience it differently too.
Yeah.
So how you navigate these conversations, like, with regard to each individual kid in the family, and what are your guys' thoughts?
My 3 kids are so vastly different from each other, and so I know that when I have a hard conversation with my oldest, he will tell me everything. That's already, like, the ground is already there, laid there, and he will just really open, bring out a book that he's reading and be like, this is what I read about. Can you tell me about this from your perspective? Like, he will do that. My middle child will not. He does not want to be vulnerable in that way. He does not want to have anybody think he doesn't know anything. And so me trying to give him information has to feel very different and come very differently for him to receive it. And so I know that I'm going to have to navigate hard conversations with those 2 kids very differently. My daughter's a whole different story. Who knows? She'll probably just have all the hard conversations. She'll guide
She'll
them
be
all.
leading them.
It'll be fine. She'll be great.
Parenting is funny in that way, right? That you have one child and it's like, okay, I got that figured out. And then they're like, oh, second child, you're complete opposite of my first child. Okay. And then third child's like, I didn't even know there was a third option. I've told that to many people. Like, there's a third option. And so knowing your kids and knowing the different ways that they respond. My oldest is not a talker about her feelings. She doesn't like it. She needs space to be able to do that. My middle is blah, 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 blah. Wants to talk about all of her feelings. What's interesting about my kids getting older, and you guys will experience this too, as your kids get older, they'll start giving you feedback about your parenting.
Oh, that's already happening,
And
sis.
things that are helpful or not helpful.
Yeah.
It's like, that's good to know. Thank you for telling me that. And so you have to get to know your kids a little bit and understand that you're not going to approach all those conversations in the same way. You're just not.
I love that though. Like, you've obviously laid some really good groundwork for your kids to be able to then like come to you to be like, hey mom, that didn't work the way that you thought it was going to work. Like, I need you to do something differently. And I think I see like my kids starting to do some of that. And I've heard stories of your kids saying the same thing, but like, I think sometimes we have to pause and say like, okay, our kids saying those things to us is a tough conversation, right? Getting feedback about our parenting is a tough conversation, but we've obviously started to lay the groundwork that kids feel comfortable having those tough conversations. So it's almost a reminder that when your kids are giving you feedback about your parenting, that is not a sign of bad parenting. That's actually a sign of really good parenting.
Yeah, I think we have this pressure, right, to be perfect parents and to show up perfectly. But I think exactly like you said, Maggie, when we're not, our kids also get an opportunity to show up in relationship. And it's not putting the pressure on them, but recognizing that these are the rhythms in life that we have with friendships, with significant others, with workplace relationships, right? I get to be attuned to you and realize you're having a hard day and bring you a coffee maybe, you know?
And like, that's who we want to put out into the world, right? We
yes.
want to put humans out into the world who are going to recognize the feelings and needs of others and then respond to them. Like, that's a beautiful thing that I'm so proud of him for having. And do I wish that I was never in a bad mood? Sort of, but also sometimes being in a bad mood allows him to build a skill of recognizing when somebody's not feeling great and then do something to make them feel better. That's beautiful.
I think what I'm walking away with this conversation and something that I'm going to use to remind myself as a parent is that courageous conversations develop courageous kids. And I think if there was a universal truth that most all parents have is we want our kids to be courageous. We want them to be able to do hard things and persevere. So thanks, ladies, for being here today and hanging out and having tough conversations about parenting.
Next time on Together We Rise.
I think it's really helpful because then we kind of feel like, okay, we've followed through on our end. There is a consequence to the thing that we've done, and she's had some ability to express her feelings about it and understanding why we're here in the first place.
Thank you for joining us. We hope today's episode left you feeling inspired, encouraged, and maybe even a little lighter.
Remember, resilience isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up, staying curious, and building stronger connections one moment at a time.
If this episode resonated with you, share it with a fellow parent or caregiver who might need the same reminder. Together, we can create a community that uplifts and empowers family everywhere.
Until next time, take care of yourself and your family. And never forget, the small, imperfect steps you take today are shaping the legacy you'll leave for tomorrow.
This series is brought to you by Tanager and the Meraki Institute of Learning. For more information, please visit tanagerplace.org.